Thank you for coming. My name's Heather Roberge. I'm chair of UCLA Architecture and Urban Design. Tonight I have the great honor of welcoming Andrés Jaque as part of the This Not That lecture series. Andrés Jaque is the founder of the Office for Political Innovation in Architectural Practice with offices in Madrid and New York. He's also a professor at Columbia's GSAPP, Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and a visiting professor at Princeton School of Architecture. The Office of Political Innovation focuses its attention on the role architecture plays in the making of societies. With each project, they explore how architecture, as practice and thought, is both delimited by socio-political and economic forces, as well as participates in making these conditions concrete. By both revealing this and proposing alternatives, their practice is indeed an office for political innovation. Their political engagement is not without aesthetic preferences or design values. So to kick off this lecture, I'll leave you with the following list of office preferences. This is just a sample. Here we go, I lost my place. The diversity and ubiquity of the everyday, the cheap and expedient, the stage set, and let us not forget the performance, vibrant, preferably fluorescent color, and the reuse of industrial and mass-produced objects. Please join me in warmly welcoming André.
Thank you so much for this nice introduction. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. I've been here already for a few days. I'm very happy to have been hosted by Mark. That I've had an amazing time and I learned so much from him. And it's also exciting to be with someone that whose work I knew and admired since a long time ago. And I had the chance to be these days with him. Also, it's been very nice to find so many friends that I see from time to time here and there, and very generous, exciting, talented friends. And well, let's start. Uh, During the last years, I've been during the last years. The Office for Political Innovation, we have been doing a series of works in very different formats. But when we look at them, they've been basically dealing with different forms of politics. Some of them very much focus on the politics of domesticity, what are the particular forms of politics that domestic architecture and domestic settings are hosting and participating on. Also on the cosmopolitics, the politics by which different natures get together and share space, resources, and cohabit and build self-dependency, and the politics of publicness, not that much seen as public space, but more as something that is performed in the association of different technologies. These are the three main focus of the different notions of politics that we've been exploring through design, through many things. This is the work that we've been doing in the last years, and you see that at the bottom, many of the things are very easy to identify as architecture, like buildings, gardens, devices of different nature, but all of them were part of a larger material mobilization, which is what you see on the upper part. Books, lectures, movies, exhibitions, installations, performances, publications in magazines, all that was part of the making of of our practice. And for me, it's very important to claim this because the reality is composed in the encounter of many different forms of technology, and to intervene it, to have an influence in it, to gain relevance as a practice, somehow, at least for us, required a symmetrical material and technological mobilization. I'd like to talk today about three things. The first And there again ways of engaging design with political practices. The first one is architecture's rendered society. This is a photograph that has been very important for me. I took it something like 15 years ago now. It's the first photograph that was taken from a very important part of one of the most photographed buildings in the history of architecture. And still, no one had ever photographed this part of the building. This is a photograph that was taken in the basement of the Barcelona Pavilion. The reconstruction, the 1980s reconstruction of the 1929 pavilion, designed and built by Mies van der Rohe and Lily Rai. Uh, it's very interesting if we see this image, that what we see here, the bottom of the lake, is basically what we see here. This is one of the pieces of glass that is covering the bottom, the lake, and that broke and was taken to the basement where it was kept. When we see the building, there's so many people that have been discussing the presence of the Kolbe sculpture there, and many people made the argument that the pavilion is producing bodies, is very much producing subjects, and that it's not only about creating space, but it's about producing uh, the production of humans. Uh, uh, but it's actually interesting to see that those bodies that the building is producing is not just an intellectual idea, but it's very literal. This is Cat Niebla. And Cat Niebla, I studied for 6 years Cat Niebla until she died a year ago. And Cat Niebla, I would say that it was produced by the pavilion in a very direct way, physically. This is another photograph from the basement. As you see, the composition is actually for me very interesting because on the one hand, all these pieces of travertine were once up there, but when they broke, they were removed because somehow broken pieces of travertine would deny the possibility of architecture of reproducing and kind of freezing an instant moment of 1929 because things age, things break, things need to be fixed. And that image of things in the making, of things being maintained, is not something that could be compatible with the way we understand Mies. So they're removed from the upper floor and they're taken down dirt to the basement. When we see these images, though, a photograph like this, you can see that there's something left of Mies and Lily Rai here. The way the composition is produced, these stones leaning in an orthogonal composition, this centered number with Futura font, it's something that totally responds to the way Lily Rai, for instance, was designing industrial exhibitions before the pavilion was designed and after the pavilion was designed. Somehow, there's something of this space that is connected to what happens in the upper floor. This is a curtain. This is the moment in which the curtain starts to fade away, and this is the moment that it was taken down to the basement. Again, in the basement, things that are taken from the upper floor are protected. They are retaining a big part of its value, of their value here. But still, the relationship between the basement and the upper floor is a little bit like the picture of Dorian Gray. Somehow, in order for the pavilion to be seen as the 1929 remain, there's a need to hide a big part of what ages, of what gets broken, of what is somehow making visible that impossibility of architecture of not evolve, not change, not be shaped by time. This is the pavilion as I propose us to see it, with its basement, a section that is hardly published. Uh, this is the pavilion, the basement of the pavilion as it was being constructed. This is the two sides, the Dorian Gray versus the nice picture. And still, this is the place, for instance, where the employees have lunch, and what they do on the walls, and that's what strikes me, is not that different to the collage that Mies van der Rohe would keep producing for his entire life. Um, okay, this is a crucial part of the design. This is the staircase, similar to the one you have here that I used before, that takes you to the basement. And it's very interesting to see what's here. Because again, this is the second, for me, this is the second called the sculpture. It's the second human being represented in the architecture. And this one is crossed by a red line, not allowing humans to go down dirt by using staircase. Anyone could think of something like this as a wrong design, as a piece of bad design, a staircase that cannot be used by humans. It seems like a bad design, but actually it's a very good design, a very intended piece of design. When the architects that reconstructed the pavilion, Ignacy Sola Morales, Christian Cirisi, and Fernando Ramos, designed the staircase, they were very intentional about it. They wanted a staircase that could never fill the license requirements, so the basement could never get permission to be used, and that was crucial. In the interviews I did with them for many years, they explained me that basically they were very concerned that at one point a new director would arrive and would have the crazy, undesirable idea that visitors could go down and see the basement. And for them, it was crucial to keep the basement invisible. No one should know that there was a basement down there. This is for me, this is another part of the basement that I love. Uh, this is the place where the gardener leaves her things. And among her things, like the hoses or this machine to remove the leaves, there's these glass boxes. The glass boxes are part of a very particular experiment that happened in the 2000s. This is a photograph from the original pavilion as it was opened in 1929, and you see that there's water lilies there. Water lilies are crucial in the work of Mies van der Rohe. They were keeping the water fresh and clean. They were removing the nitrates and the phosphates from the water. They were mainly used in botanic gardens all around Europe as a mean to keep the water clear. But that was not seen by the architects who did the reconstruction. That literally, as they would tell me, they would never see the water lilies. They were looking at the pictures and they thought it was an accident. It was kind of the decoration that was brought for the opening of the exhibit of the pavilion. Uh, when the when they uh, reconstructed it, they installed a swimming pool filtering system with chlorine that made it impossible in the future to bring back the water lilies that could die in the contact with the chlorine water. These glass boxes were an invention of the gardener that thought that if he wanted or she wanted to bring the water lilies, she could have these boxes with fresh water and the water lilies in, and they could be introduced in the lake. So basically, the water lilies would be in fresh water surrounded by chlorine water. That invention never worked because the water lilies would grow and they would send another leaf that would touch the chlorine water and the whole plant would die. But for me, what is very interesting is that the conflicts of the pavilion, the tentative process of designing it, the permanent evolution with new ideas that come up and that turn people aware of aspects of the pavilion that they had forgotten, are not in the upper part, but are then down there in the basement. The basement is the real archive of what happens up there, and is presenting things not as instant realities, but as realities that convened other people, social tissues, experiments, long-term discussions, evolutions in the way we think architecture, all those dimensions, those collective dimensions that turn architecture into something that we all share, that we all as a society are part of, are invisibilized down there in the basement. I'd like now to go back to Gata Niebla, to Cat Fog. She lives down in the basement. This is actually the place where she lives. you see, I mean, all this is normally in the dark because I switch on the lights to take the photograph. But Gata Niebla is been living for many years, or for many years before she died, lived in the darkness of the basement, where she was taken to make sure that the pavilion would never have mice or rodents. Here you see her again, a few months before she died, and she's got a very particular uh, uh, eyes, because basically by being there in the basement, her body was physically transformed. Her eyes uh, were suffering atrophia macular, and she became blind. Uh, this is very important for me because, in a way, it's an extreme case of something that we could perceive everywhere in architecture. The cat Niebla, Gata Niebla, was producing the pavilion herself. She was producing it as a cosmopolitical composition by removing the mice in it, by being part of selecting what would be the part of the pavilion and what won't be part of the pavilion. But she was also transformed by the architecture herself. So she was both producing and being produced by the pavilion. In my opinion, this is what I believe is important about architecture. Architecture is not hosting society and bodies. It's not just a container, like a box where you put the society, but it's actually society itself. It's produced by society and it's producing society simultaneously. What we did as a project was reconfigure the hierarchy by which things could be set either in the basement or in the upper part. We were playing actually with this techno society, and we were recombining them, recomposing, rearticulating the disposition of things between the two floors, so new realities could be composed, new societies, new um, associations could happen. This is somehow what I believe design is about. These things are often perceived as if they were parallel things in our practice, but I believe that this is the same that doing a building, that basically we intervene existing realities, and that the work of architects, at least the one that I want to do and the one I admire, is very much about rearticulating the composition, the material composition of societies, both human and non-human. Architecture for me, it's about rearticulation. This is a project we did a long time ago in Madrid, and this is the distribution of the most important art, contemporary art centers in Madrid. You see that they're very much aligned and very concentrated in the center. At the time we were doing that, these were the artists and the people doing culture and creative activities that we liked the best. And we did this as a way of saying, well, there's many different geographies that, and these people had never been invited in Matadero. That was the cultural center that we were called to work in. Somehow there was a conflict between a network of spaces that were occupying a very particular part of society or of the city, and this society of people doing things that had never been invited in the place we were called to intervene in. For us, the project that was mainly expressed as an intervention in a square that was too exposed to the sun and that was really uncomfortable during the summer, and we were called to do a shading strategy in it. Actually, they were asking us to cover the whole square with a fabric or something like that. But we decided to do something else. We decided to do two movable devices that we called Scala Box, Beetle and Voice, produce of voice giver, something like that, like a combination of these two words, Scala Box, uh, as two devices that, on the one hand, would make it possible to go through the square in the shade, but would do that without affecting the adaptability of the space. They would be movable, and they would be basically keeping the flexibility of the space. But we would design them not as objects alone, but as a constellation of different rolling elements, pieces of furniture, equipment, uh, uh, constellation of things that would come with these devices that would be over equipped with speakers, projectors, computers, and that could move easily with an app that anyone could download in his her phone. The idea was that these elements were actually responding to a very particular need, the need of public space to operate not only as a box where people can go, but actually as a network of technologies that could enable people to occupy the space and bring their activities that they could not do elsewhere. These are the Scarabox. And for me, what is interesting is that we created sort of an institution within the institution. Uh, all those people that would have never been invited to Matadero because maybe they would not have been even known by the people that were running the museum would now go there without being invited and organize their own activities. This is, for instance, a bunch of people that decided to present or to organize a festival of independent magazines and publications, and they would do it there. And this is a totally different thing. It's a knife throwing uh, activity that this guy organized. All these different things that happen here somehow we're recomposing the possibility of the all these spaces of creativity, art, culture, and the museum, and they would totally transform the way the space of the city was related to particular associations by which creation and art was being part or not being part of institutions. In a very different way, this is the last project that we finished, and it's a much kind of enclosed project. It's the project of a restaurant and a bakery that we did in Madrid city center in the same city, uh, and the way we address here the recomposition of society was very different. This is the image that of the restaurant, the upper part of it, and which is basically a very experimental chef that is doing an amazing, um, different way of addressing cuisine. But for me, it's interesting in terms of the of what I'm explaining is that we decided to work with different artisans, whereas in most Europe the technology that you see here, marble, gold, metal, even wooden paneling like here, it's something that was very common 20 years ago. And there was a whole network of people that knew how to work with this. There was a moment in which the new hipster trends were making it very difficult to all this network of artisans, of highly qualified artisans, to keep doing their job. Actually, that was together, even though the kind of recycled wood places were perceived as more kind of friendly, more independent, were actually the entry point of a huge number of corporations that were occupying the space of hospitality and were moving away a big part of the independent businesses that in the past were trying to work with this refinement of the refinement of marble, gold, leather materials. What we did here is basically to bring back those traditions and to bring to the table these artisans. But of course, we did it in a different way. For instance, we didn't use the marble paneling attached to the walls. We decided to create a tensegrity of wooden panels. This is actually a statuary marble, the one that Michelangelo was using in his sculpture. But we brought it in a very simple way. We combine it with wires, and we created distance security that actually now it's, if you get into TripAdvisor, you see that there's people that say that they're really uncomfortable here because they think that they're going to die sliced by one of these triangles, marble triangles, because it's super thin. It's actually 15 millimeters. But we're combining it, of course, with diachronic paneling and many other things. So, but for me, this is the second case that I wanted to bring because somehow the technology that we were using here were related to a way of bringing back a network of artisans that now are in their 70s and 80s and that were no longer part of the city. In here, for instance, the rearticulation was very different. This is a house we did in Ibiza for an art collector. We call it the house in Never Neverland. And actually, it's very interesting for me that Christopher Hawthorne came to Ibiza to see this. Actually, he came to Madrid and we flew to Ibiza. So, wow, it's great to see that California is expanding now to Ibiza. So he was thinking that it was very Californian as an experiment. But for me, what is interesting is that the house was really uh, this the geometry of the house came from the fact that we had to make compatible the environmental and ecosystemical wealth of the valley with the design of the house that was catering also to a very particular art collection and that was also catering uh, to the hedonistic life that the owners that were very party oriented, super social, very famous in Ibiza, wanted to have in the house. So the house was a little bit a party place, but at the same time, party needed to be um, assembled with the porosity with the permeability of the ground, so the uh, vegetation there could be preserved and the water would keep going to the aquifers, the rainfall, with the trees, with the bushes, with the trajectories of the migrating birds, with the trajectories of rodents on the surface. So in a way, all that had to be made compatible. I bring these drawings because this was not something that we could do without architectural and design tools. What you see here is a huge effort or an effort on drawing every single bush, every single tree, every single stone. All of these things needed to be represented and presented because this is kind of a little bit of a parliament of all the things that count. We were using design tools to recognize what were the things that needed to remain there. And the design came in the in-betweens of all these things and in a way with the qualities that would enable for the house to be compatible with the preservation of the environmental capital that was there. These are all these different documents. I could be for 2 hours showing different models, different drawings, new models. These ones, for instance, are the ones in which we were doing calibrations of the geometry of the structure to make it possible to have the columns in the right place where we were not affecting any crucial place for the distribution of water, of the trajectories of water. This is what it looks. Uh, and this is the other part. This is the part of the hedonistic life of the art collection, of the hospitality program the owners wanted to have. Uh, this is the trajectory of the water. This is, yeah. This is the house a year after. Okay, second point, and of three, out of three. Multiplying the spectrum of the possible. This is a sentence that comes from Isabel Stengers. I'm a big fan of Isabel Stengers, but I think it also comes from architecture. This is an image from the New Landscape in Art and Science by Georgi Kepes, 1956. For me, it's very interesting to see that architecture has a long tradition on bringing together heterogeneous components and doing it in a way that art, um, politics, and science were simultaneously mobilized. This trajectory is the one that I believe architecture is discussing now. And new challenges, like for instance climate change or gender fluidity, somehow are requiring again the assemblage of politics, science, and art in a way that architecture can gain a voice in ongoing, uh, super relevant discussions in which our societies are being reconstructed. Everyone knows this probably, no? Uh, isn't it? Right? Everyone knows powers of 10. Powers of 10 for me is, again, an architectural element, an architectural device that was bringing together art, architecture, politics, and science. And I would like you to take a look to the frame. The main character of this movie, this white square that is centering the micro society of the picnic. And of course, frames were not something strange in the images world. They were all day long framing themselves. The frame is the big character. They could have taken the photograph without the frame here, just with the white background, but they wanted the photograph with the frame. They wanted the photograph with the architecture framing them. The images are about frame making and frames that are framing themselves, framing couples, framing society, framing bodies. They were framing all day long. They were about framing. They were good at framing, and they had this table with lights to frame things. So basically, you see that they were invested on framing. Uh, the Powers of 10 is the result of Cosmic View, or it's inspired in Cosmic View, the universe in 40 jams, 1957, a year after Georgi Kepes did the page I showed you. And Judith Bronovsky, an intern at that time in the MS's office, literally said they took the book and they cut the photographs and they made me do a movie with a tiny camera, moving from one picture to another, doing the first version that was released only, or I've seen just a few years ago, of basically a Powers of 10 that was coming from here. This book, Cosmic View, was done by Chris Booker. Chris Booker is this guy here. He was an architect, a pedagogist, and the inventor of an alternative to democracy, sociocracy. Sociocracy was super influential in LA. And if you go now to the Ecovilla in the Ecovilla in downtown, they will tell you that they do not believe in democracy. They believe in sociocracy, which is basically an alternative to democracy. Whereas the representation of minorities is not important. What is important is the rule of consensus. The rule of consensus is defended as a way to bring politics into action in an efficient way, to keep societies focused, would say Kisbuke in Democracy as It Might Be, that he wrote in 1945. Where did this come from? This idea that it would be better to have a center society that no longer spends so much time, so many efforts in this not efficient activity of bringing the representation of minorities to a parliament. It was coming from the experience that both Keith Booker and Betty Cadbury, his partner, had in Cadbury town in Bourneville. Betty Cadbury was the daughter of the owner of Cadbury, the chocolate maker, that created Bourneville as a town city where the company would replace the making of politics. So instead of having a chamber, people voting, they basically would have a good trust that on behalf of the employees of Cadbury would deal with the city, with the politics of the city, basically, uh, just to guarantee that the society would be focused in producing chocolates. The second character that I think is crucial in Powers of 10 is the Zoom. The Zoom was also invented in 1956. So, like Georgie Kepes, everything happened in 1956. This is the Zoom, the Pierre Anginio one. Uh, and I'd like to see what's a Zoom inside. Because basically, the zoom is a series of lenses that are adapting the possibility of adapting the focus to different distances. And what the zoom does is produce the possibility of moving from one lens to another, in producing the feeling of non-discontinuity. So what is important in the zoom for me is the case. This black case that is hiding the fact that inside this homogeneous or perceived as homogeneous element that is providing non-discontinuity, basically there's a super discontinuous society of lenses. So for me, what happens in the zoom is that a number of heterogeneous lenses are black box invisibilized in the same way that the basement is invisibilized in a big part of the social dimension of the pavilion. The black case, taking the term that the sociologist of technology developed, black box, is actually working as a literal black box that is hiding the impossibility of, of non-discontinuity. But this is something that happened in this other black box, the storyboard of Powers of 10. This is a photogram that for me is crucial. Nancy Anderson and Michael Dietrich discussed extensively this photogram. The images and their team were basically taking photographs from scientific magazines to produce the movie Powers of 10. But they were selecting them because of their scale and because they were beautiful. And from time to time, they would have, oh, surveillance scanning to see the virus. From time to time, they would find that there were accidental things jumping in. For instance, this is the moment in which this cell, a human cell, this is the nucleus, and you see how this virus is injecting DNA into the nucleus and is replacing the DNA of the human cell by its own DNA, producing an infection. What is very interesting is that someone wrote virus and then someone erased it. But this, what we know for sure, is that this photograph was rejected. Judith Bronovic, Judith Bronovsky, remembered that this photograph was rejected because no one wanted disease to be shown as normal in the selection of images that were explaining what human and universe were about. So diseases and many other things were removed from the frame. The frame was a machine a device to avoid certain aspects of being depicted, mobilized, included in the architecture of the images we're producing. This is a work we did a few years ago. Actually, Jimenez was there, I remember, yeah. In Lisbon, in the Lisbon Triennial, we presented our alternative version of Powers of 10. Powers of 10 that when then we repeated in Chicago, and then we did in Mexico, and then we did in, it's been touring all around. And that was basically our way to, to introduce many of the people, many of the things, many of the realities that were left behind the frame. We were operating basically reenacting the movie, but instead of doing it with a film, we were doing it as a theater play, as an opera, uh, in which basically we would show how difficult it was to keep the focus, to keep society's focus as Keith Booker wanted. And as we were doing these scenes, as we were reenacting the movie, many other things would jump in. For instance, this is polio. Polio was a fundamental part of Powers of 10. Philip Morrison, the scientific advisor of the movie, and the guy that gives the voiceover, was suffering polio or suffered polio when he was a kid. And as a result of that, he carried uh, effects on his body that went with him all his life. He ended up in a wheelchair as a result of that, and he was struggling for his entire life with that. um, the movie somehow is not including a big part of the humans that were saved by virus that were removed from the movie. But not only that, Philip Morrison was part of the Manhattan Project. He was the person that put the bomb, the A bomb, in the airplane with his hands that bombed Hiroshima. Another scaling up reality very similar to the Thumb effect that the images were showing that it was inevitable in the Cold War when you would see an escalation from atoms to the universe to think of the A bomb. And that was the logic that somehow was prompting the invention of the Thumb and the invention of the A bomb as simultaneous realities in a way. Um, but he was also someone that became an activist against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Uh, Philip Morrison was one of the scientists that was sent on field to describe the effects of the bombs, and he would publish and become an activist advocating for an international agreement to stop the proliferation of bombs, nuclear weapons. All these realities for me are crucial to understand what was happening in the 70s in the world. And somehow, when the movie was released, and somehow they were intentionally or at least accidentally, but in a sad way, removed from the narration of what was happening in the galaxies and in the universe. Not only that, Philip Morrison would say, his voice would say, the galaxy is empty. If you remember the text of the movie, he would say, showing the dark image of the galaxies, this emptiness is normal. What is unique is uh, the richness of our neighborhoods. But he never believed that. This is an article he published in Nature in which he was defending the possibility of getting in touch with beings, with creatures, with aliens living in the outer space. He actually was influential and he designed or he was the author of the theory that enabled to Ohio State University to build Big Ear, this antenna specifically designed to get in touch with people in the outer space that actually was once receiving this message, wow, that was understood as a message coming from the galaxies, from fellow creatures trying to communicate with humankind. All this for me is much more exciting. That was the reality that they were living at that time, and that was not the empty galaxy that they described. The grass that they were standing or they were lying on was also another arena, another discussion that the movie was not reflecting. This was the moment in which Monsanto developed brilliant, this species of grass that could grow really slow and that could totally transform the ecosystems of the US in what the New York Times called a urbanized twin. The CEO of Monsanto at that time claimed that they were not fixing nature; they were just creating superior species, and superior species like this were also resulting in the elimination of a huge number of vegetal species from the U.S. Kodachrome was the phone that was used to shoot this movie. This was the Cindy card that was used to calibrate the colors, and that made it impossible until the 1980s to photograph until the 1990s to photograph people with dark skin. uh, the film itself was another frame of exclusion. And when in the civil rights movement was introducing people, African Americans, in majoritarily white high schools, and they were doing the Facebook, the yearbook photograph, African Americans would never be depicted. They would be shown as black spots in the general picture of the classes. And for me, the most or one of the most crucial images that the movie introduces is the direct identification of the genes with the guy. The genes are defining the gender of this guy in the movie right at the time, and this is again the 1950s, where there was a long tradition in California and in the whole U.S. to discuss gender and transgender realities. Uh, this was these were not uh, things that were strange for anyone at that time. There were popular movies like this one in 1953 by Ed Wood that was really informing of this or this. It was actually very active. The LGBTQ movement in a place like Los Angeles was very active already in the 1970s. Well, I mean, it's not that late, to be honest. And what we did was reenact this. We brought historical in every time we do this. We brought historical activists, transgender activists that had been active already in the 1970s to take the position of the person of which of whose genes are scrutinized by the movie. So we're basically bringing other realities that were out of the frame. This is for me an architecture. For me, I would say this is a radical or kind of political interior decoration. This is a project of interior design that we propose to inhabit. And we think that architecture is not just a neutral provider of space, but is actually a frame in which things are in, things are out. And if we have to select, we propose to bring in all these things that are actively being discussed now and that are the arenas in which our societies, or by which, or a number of arenas by which our societies are redefining, reinventing themselves. But this radical interior design, I would call it, or this whatever interior design that I love to do, is also practical. It's also catering to particular needs. This is, for instance, Bruno Latour presenting his new ideas on modernity and in the ZKN, and using this living room, this planetary living room, as the space where he could explain his notions of political ecology. And by pointing at the objects that we placed there, basically he could somehow become an activist on the politics of technology in at this moment. This is a different project. Uh, this is uh, this is a seminar, a minor seminar, a place where Catholic, where priests or where kids, actually 12-year-old kids, could be educated to become priests. This is actually a palace, 15th century palace, that was in the since the 15th century was basically producing Catholic priests to be sent to America, and they were sent to Peru. They would be sent to Cuba. They would be sent to Mexico. They would be sent to California to open missions and to evangelize the world, the new world, what they were called. It was a very transnational invention, an expanding project that through architecture would do something similar to this scaling up that the images were proposing. But what is interesting for me is that when you look at these photographs from the 1950s, the time in which this discussion, Georgie Kepes was posing, started, this was happening there. Bodies were regularized, were homogenized by common practices like doing exercise together, all of them wearing the same clothes, by instructor that would organize them. When we look at architecture, what's playing a key role here? This is, for instance, the bedrooms where the kids, those kids that were in the photograph, were sleeping. They were designed so a priest could go around at night watching what was happening in each room. So architecture, again, was not a neutral actor here, was playing politics here in a very direct way by shaping the bodies of those that could travel to other places to transform the locations and the bodies of those where they would arrive. We won the competition to transform this building. This is the palace, the 15th century palace with its 19th century extension. And this is the new extension we did and the transformation we did to the whole building. Um, we won the competition to, at the time that there were not that many kids that wanted to be priests, to transform that into an elder residence for uh, retiring Catholic priests. So it was actually the end of the process. This is the way it looked. Uh, this is the way it looked. So we were trying to, in each different part, we were trying to open the building to the neighbors, to basically provide spaces for the different pieces that were surrounded these historical buildings and in the historical center of Placentia, and trying to connect what was happening here, opening it to spaces with squares, with furniture that would connect them to their neighbors. And that's what you see here. But we did something else. We reconstruct the spaces and we equip them, or we brought to the spaces the possibility for people to perform politically, to take decisions, to engage with others, to raise issues as part of their daily life. We did it through the inclusion of a number of technologies, technologies that we call the political toys, and that would basically design to make it required for people to take risky decisions in order for the house to become functional. We did it from the church to the chapel that you see here to every single part of the building. This is, for instance, one case. The garden, we decided to define it or to put numbers, defining a space for each of the people living here. So if you were living in room number 7, you would be taking decisions of this part of the garden. But we never defined the limits or the paths to get to each part. That was part of a negotiation that people had to engage with. This is a photograph that Domus took when Stefan Boeri was directing it. He wanted to photograph this because he couldn't believe it was an elder residence for Catholic priests, retiring Catholic priests. He thought it was a center for skaters or something like that. So he came to see it, and he with a photographer, and they took this photograph, and uh, and for me it was very intriguing. What was this guy doing here? I asked him, did you ask him to give scale to the photograph? No, no, he was there. He would never leave, so we found it very, very interesting, and we included him in the photograph. But actually, I followed up what was happening here. And this guy was number 16, basically. He was living in number 16 room. He had gone through a whole process of controversies because uh, he started growing onions in his piece of lot, and there were other people that were defending that onions were very vulgar to have in the garden. These people started to gain support, so they were really making it very hard for him to have the onions. But he found a number of other guys that would allow him to use their lots that were actually these ones here. So he started to basically grow the problem to make his presence stronger there. A political tool. He started to occupy more space. The flower people did something that was very clever, in my opinion. They found an expert, this lady, a neighbor that was a professional gardener, that came here and said very clearly that growing onions from the point of view of an expert was totally wrong. That they should really support this bunch of people that were the flower people against this other bunch of people that were discussing two onions. This is a photograph that for me is very important because at the time that I was doing this research on the following the controversy, these were the actors. These people here is the flower people. This is the onion people. This is the flower. This is a flower person that is uh, uh, working together with these people. And for me, this is a very important image because somehow we can think of architecture not as something that is providing a happy ending, rendering of society with everyone smiling, everyone consensually agreeing, but an image like this in which a number of people engage with different options could share space, could share the frame, not being happy with each other necessarily, but somehow being able to be part of the same celebration. This image of society for me is much more exciting than the picnic of the Eames. I wish the Eames at one point had done a movie with transgender people, with different kinds of grass, with the conflicts our society are facing, with the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the people that are confronting that. This is the origin of a series of projects that we're doing now, in which we're trying to see what's the way that individuality could be somehow be brought together with the making of collective life. A number of projects in which basically we're trying to produce societies out of conflict and out of the encounter of the difference. This is, for instance, a compound that we're developing in Vasby in Sweden, that is the result actually of composing together many, many different things. And in a town that is a dormitory town of Stockholm, that where basically most of the housing schemes are just bringing equal apartments repeated once and again. What we're proposing is to create centrality by mixing different uses, light industry with workshop activities, with very different types of residents, with sport infrastructures, with daycare for all people, mixed with or simultaneously functioning as uh, daycares for babies, for children. Well, this is a project, for instance, that we're also developing is a transformation of an existing building to turn it progressively, slowly into a contemporary art museum. the ZKN, and that hopefully will finish in 3 years with this huge Juliana Huxtable, a huge sculpture that we want to do, that people want to inhabit or can inhabit, basically, if they want. But it's been a process that we've been working already 3 years, slowly transforming this existing building, removing parts of it, inviting artists to work doing installations, temporary installations that are bringing the people of the district to inhabit temporarily these places and to experience them differently. This is, for instance, the last installation that was done in a huge space that we created in the building by eliminating existing floors. We connected 5 different floors, and now we have this huge space that was that we were very happy that a graphic designer could work here producing this wallpaper for it, and that has been used. Uh, oh, there's the sound. You have the sound there? Let's see with sound. No, no, it's better with the sound. Okay, but it's being used now. For instance, they brought the whole scene of bogging and of alternative dancing that is happening around this building to the inside of the museum, and the museum became actually a museum of bogging. And for me, it was I don't know what the music is amazing. Here we go. So this is without music, and this is with the music. Ah, no, you have it? Oh, we were testing it. Let's see it again. Oh, what is it? Okay, well, you can imagine. It's a little bit RuPaul, or Paris is Burning, rather. Yeah, it's a little bit like bringing Paris is Burning to the museum. But I'm totally amazed with this because I think, again, the different aesthetics, the materials, the dancing, the bodies, the ways of behaving. If you see the public, it's not necessarily what we see here in the center in the run. How do you call it? The run. Well, the runway exactly. Uh, but this is something that somehow was prompted by the architecture and the whole process of architecture as a process of enrollment. And let's go to the third one, which is about New York. I live in New York. I have my main office now in New York, uh, and I'm very interested on how an architectural practice can occupy a space in New York. And I would like to think of architecture as the assemblage of difference. This is 432, this building that, in my opinion, is divided architectural criticism, or let's say architecture at large. Because on the one hand, many people think, okay, we look at this tower, we don't like what it means, but it's cool, it's elegant, it's kind of refined, it's a little bit of a Hoffman object, uh, looks good. Um, Architecture is not really about the other part. Uh, and there's architects that say, well, this is the actual evidence that architecture has to take a stance and decide whether it's an actor in the making of inequality or it's picking a whole tradition of architecture to deal with urban space, with the police, with politics, and find ways to confront this. I think there's a need to rethink architecture to be able to or to pay attention to what architecture is about at this point to understand what is at stake in this discussion. This is two of the renderings that were produced by D-Box. What I would defend are the real architects of this building. And when you see these renderings, you see that 80% of what we see through the windows, the main feature of this building, the square building, the windows, is sky. The building is very much the result of this project by many people, but that Michael Bloomberg was very clear at expressing, if we bring as many billionaires as we can to New York, it would be a godsend. Uh, but actually, this is something that has been running since the 1970s, when Elizabeth, the ship container harbor of Elizabeth, took over what the leadership that in the past the New York Harbor had, and basically extracted the economical activity that the city was living by. Uh, at this point, the result of a number of transformations, legal, economical, architectural, urbanistic transformations, uh, the proliferation of towers where LLCs are used as shell companies to buy properties as a way to attract international money that is laundered in New York, that as many of the cities in the world is international cities, global cities, has become location to an onshoring location for money. It's transforming the city, not only because of all these towers that are emerging, but because a big part of the population is being displaced from a place that no longer has affordable housing. If we go back to architecture, there's a number of transformations that were introduced at all these different scales to make architecture be part of this process. This is, for instance, uh, the uh, the first image that D-Box produced to explain the concept of 432. And they used just an image of the glass filtering the sky. But that is not a metaphor. It was not a kind of an illustration of a concept. It was an architectural detail. This is the glass that was used in 432. Is the Echtel glass, an Austrian glass that is called light wall. That is the most expensive component of the building, and that was selected because it has this capacity of polarizing the blue part of the light spectrum to exaggerate the blue component of the sky. So when we see these images, basically what was designed in the rendering was then taken to the detail of architecture, to the materiality of architecture. The windows cannot be opened. I would defend that they're not. It's not possible to open any window in this building, because if you would open them, you would see that the glasses are literally tinting, dyeing the color of the sky. So to prevent that from being perceptible, the windows are fixed and they're used, and this particular use glass is used. But this is also a design that is happening at the environmental level. This is Susquehanna Valley, where a big part of the pollution of the dioxin sulfate of New York air is being moved. The same year, in 2012, Bloomberg approved the Clean Heating Act, a project that mobilized millions of dollars to promote the transformation of boilers in New York from being fueled by oil to be fueled by natural gas. 2013, a year later, New York State banned the extraction of natural gas in the state through fracking. 60% of the natural gas that is now consumed in New York City is coming from Susquehanna Valley, where the water, as you know, is being highly polluted, and where exactly the same amount of dioxin sulfates that were removed from New York air can now be measured there in Susquehanna Valley. What is very interesting for me is that the huge transformation of the underground of Susquehanna Valley, of Marcellus Shale, is related to the transformation of New York economy. So the detail of renderings, the material detail of the glass in the windows, the way the windows are fixed, the way the windows are framing the helicopter views, the design of the air of New York City, the displacement of the extraction of gas from New York State to Susquehanna Valley, all these layers of scales of design, all these designs that are operating at different scales, like the project of the IMSS, are all convened and assembled together to produce a very particular transformation of the city of New York through the elimination of toxicity, of the cohabitants with toxicity. This is a project, and with this I would like to finish, that we did a few years ago in New York. It's called Cosmo, and it was a party machine, a party device, like a big mirror ball made of shit, made of toxicity. It was installed there in the MoMA PS1, a little bit of a window, a storefront, or a glass, a big a point of visibility for the city. where we brought this architecture, and that immediately, this is 20 minutes later in its opening, it was circulating already everywhere online. So basically, we were doing an action, an activism, or a mixture of design, activism, and many other things to confront the way toxicity and centrality in the management of toxicity was removed from New York City. This machine was learning from a number of architectures from the 60s that were developed by many people, mainly by John Todd, combining ecosystems, like for instance this wetland ecosystem, with this combination of hoses that were exposing, we were taking actually literally shit because we were taking water from the sewage system the days that it was raining heavily, in which, as you know, the system in New York mixed the fecal water with the rainfall, and we were bringing this literally to these tanks and making it circulate to these houses exposed to this wetland ecosystem, super rich, very engineered. We were working with Arup and with Jochen Seher, with the main experts on ecological design. Uh, and as a result, after a week, the water that we were making circulate from to these ecosystems was purified and you could drink it. This is, for instance, the moment that we were taking it to what we call the algae bag, where there was the presence of floating lepna that would remove the nitrates, like a little bit like the water lilies of the Parthenon Pavilion. This is the waterfall that would increase the diluted oxygen in the water. So all this process was basically meant to purify the water and to manage on site with toxicity, bringing the toxicity not instead of taking it to Susquehanna Valley, basically to keeping it there, but it was also designed so the whole process could become visible and understandable by the people partying around it, that could then understand that there was a possibility of cohabiting with toxicity as an alternative to the whole process the city was going through. We also uh, work with the Department of Interface Design in NYU, designing this lighting system that would convey the evolution of the water and would translate that in colors, and with a number of devices that could work online, explaining from how to do your own Cosmo to what was the evolution of the presence of toxicity in New York, to what was the point in which or to which the toxicity of New York was taken. So this is, in a way, what I believe architecture is about. Not that much the provision of space, neutral space for society, but more or less the actual composition of society, the composition or the contribution, together with many other forces, to the making of the assemblages of the groups of heterogeneous components uh, by which we live by, and compositions in which the contemporary conflicts and the forms of politics that we are disputing, where they are embodied. These compositions where politics are now embodied and where architecture has a great opportunity to become very relevant. Thank you very much. Yes, of course. Questions, complaints, petitions, activism, voguing. Yeah, if someone wants to dance, yeah, good answer. Yeah.
Andres, thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful lecture. Um, you know, your work is on my mind all the time, especially recently. Uh, so if I've been thinking a lot. I mean, you sort of show Wiki Village, and I think Rolling House is something that you didn't show today. But Rolling House, I think, and Wiki Village are related as projects.
Yep.
If I were to think about these two projects and trace them back to two other projects that I consider to be lineages that you belong to, in the middle, we might find the High Rise of Homes from James Wines.
Yeah.
And one step before that would be the 1909 theorem from A.B. Walker, which was made famous by Rem Koolhaas in Delirious, New York. And so I believe, Wiki Village and Rolling House belong to that tradition. But there's a very different attitude between the three chapters. And the chapter that you represent, which I think myself and many others belong to, has a, I guess, a non-ironic relationship with the stack, which the middle chapter seemed to represent. And I wonder, and I've been, I guess, dying to ask you what your relationship with these two previous chapters might be.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's a very good question. Um, I think irony is not the opposite of um activism, let's say. I think that sense of humor, irony, even the grotesque, often is perceived as non-serious, non-engaged. But actually, when we look in detail, there's forms of politics that are very much embedded in them. And they're doing that in a way that often is very constructive. So I believe that politics, for me, are not that much about um, direct confrontation, like you think this or there's this reality, I go against it. It's more about expanding what is possible around it, bringing alternative, recomposing what is there with other things. And that's a very effective way of transforming things. So producing alternative, basically, and engage or assembling the alternative there. And I think things like irony, uh, like sense of humor, are very much already decomposing what exists and creating other trajectories, other narratives around it. I think that the projects that you're mentioning belong to a very particular time, a time in which we feel probably that it's not that easy to gain agency in ongoing processes that are globally expanding, and that there's the feeling that no one really is in control of them. I think this is very different to the context in which the other cases that you explained were operating at the time that probably they thought that they could do much more, that they had more agency on reality. I believe that we're in a very different time, the time in which we need to create alternative, because there's really no possibility to have a discussion on how things are being managed. The power, even the power of Trump, is limited at this point compared to the whole inertia that, for instance, neoliberal capitalism is taken. And I believe that a way of being activist at this point is probably more about or more about creating alternative networks and taking them to the place where things are important. So yeah, I don't know if this responds, but I think it's totally related to sense of humor. If you cannot challenge power, you can make people laugh about power and then somehow undermine it, and create alternatives. How do you do with your work? Because you also your irony in your work is crucial, isn't it? Uh,
Yeah, which is why I'm kind of working through it because
yeah,
I don't think it's I don't think I mean I struggle with it right now, especially now. I think, um, and maybe the especially with your work, you are trying to help, which is very different from people who are purely ironic and using irony as purely a rhetorical device.
I hear you.
You are a sincere person, and I think that's a major difference between some of the people that I'm talking like Wines, for instance. I think
Yeah.
entirely of the rhetorical device is not what you do, and it's not what I want to do.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge difference between being ironical and being cynical. I would never defend cynicism or even skepticism. I wouldn't defend that. I think we have a responsibility really to do things and to think that we can do things and that they can produce a change, of course. So yeah, that's very important.
Um, so I guess maybe one of the ways I'm trying to read your work is that there's sorry. Um, one of the ways I'm trying to that I'm seeing to read your work is that there's like an underlying mode of production in that of cropping, where recomposing the frame might instigate a different type of hierarchy. It seems as though that's kind of a link between the projects. And um, I don't know if I'm reading too far into where you ended up with the PS1 project, but it seems that the place where you ended is um, where the shit gets exposed is yet another type of reframing. And I'm really curious if that particular mode of reframing has some relationship to the history of shit, the core text, where that specific mode of hiding shit was one thing that kind of led to a mode of civilization that may have some kind of link between where we are today, where that comes from.
Yeah, general terms, I think I mean, your reading of the general strategy behind the project, I totally agree. It's about, uh, yeah, producing new connections, different, or reconnecting things differently, and by doing that, also creating different hierarchies. I totally agree. I, I, I believe it's very important. Hierarchy is what makes somehow it dynamizes societies. It's also producing displacement from one point to other, and also opportunities for dependency, for collaboration, solidarity. For politics depend a little bit or in a big part by hierarchy. Uh, but hierarchies need to be challenged all the time and need to be composed as multiple, as plural. Many hierarchies overlap and disputing somehow producing alternative networks where things can happen differently. And I believe that architecture can do that. At the same time, can do the opposite, can empower society, can reduce many of these networks, can eliminate a big part of alternative hierarchies that are operating. And I think that that is happening all the time. In regards to shit, I think it's one of these ideas that, of course, the modern idea is just to look at shit from one perspective. And okay, this produces diseases, for instance, so we have to get rid of this. And of course, that's true. Uh, but it's loaded with other programs, other agendas that are not that clear. And in this case, for instance, the claim of eliminating toxicity from New York City was mobilizing huge budgets, was basically rating New York uh, but at the cost, at the environmental cost of polluting other locations, was producing a super clean location by redistributing its environmental cost to other locations that were being very much over polluted by that. And there's very alternative ways, or many alternative ways of doing that. We can basically think that there's an environmental justice by which uh, any society has to integrate the environmental cost of what is sustaining it. But also, I think that the very division between what is shit and what is not shit is very, very politically loaded, because not necessarily what we see here is that bad. Uh, the organic material, the fecal material, is not bad at all. It can be stinky, but you can deal with this. You can find ways of not have it that thin. But basically something that could be perfectly integrated. Uh, so I believe that developing a culture in which society needs to think the way it deals with its own realities, rather than thinking that there's a big part of what happens that can be removed and live within the fantasy that is not producing a collateral effect that is making other people take the cost of what is happening at one point. I think it's crucial at this point, and I would believe that architecture has a great capacity to invent very attractive situations in which that are not based in this unequal redistribution of the cost.
So I think all of your observations and your research is really admirable. A question I have is one of scale.
Mhm.
So, in all of the projects, these kind of, I would call the societies that you produce
Mhm.
kind of micro societies. So, if you want to produce 3,000 gallons of water, this kind of ecology works. when you need to produce 300 million gallons of water, their design requires hierarchies
Yes.
in order to operate at scale. So I wonder if for you, the end project or the kind of end goal is to um, use the kind of micro societies to demonstrate macro effects. But what does one do when they want design to scale?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. Uh, in a way, I think that the process, and it has to do with the innovation, the processes of innovation. Realities are um, operating simultaneously at many different scales, but the gateway to change them uh, normally comes from very tiny scales. So if we think of any architectural innovation, often it starts with very tiny uh, prototypes that somehow scale up progressively. And the design of that progression is part of the design of the prototype. In the in the situations that we're dealing with, there's a huge inertia. For instance, if we think of public space, if we think of toxicity, even if we think about the way museums deal with culture, uh, it's very slow to produce a transformation. But going to come to the structure of scientific revolutions, which are not necessarily it's the model that the only model that can be produced, I think we can learn that there's a need to go through certain steps in which, for instance, we change cultures or we could produce evidences that people can relate to, and we can start or be connect ourselves with ongoing discussions and support them a little bit. And this small or this way of operating in a prototyping direction, addressing key issues that in the future uh, will grow differently, I think is crucial. Now, for instance, we're working with the Victoria and Albert Museum in an exhibition that is called The Future Starts Here. And the exhibition that is curated, and we're designing it, and we're creating all the interfaces, and it's curated by Rory Hyde and Mariana Pestana, and it's opening in a month, I believe. Um, Basically, they've been tracking, and we've been helping them to track many of the process of innovation that started in the 19th century, and how they started with just tiny conversations that introduced new words, for instance. But then they grew, they grew, they grew. So in a way, architecture has a great responsibility on what is the images that we make circulate, because they are prototyping possibilities for the future. And I would I would actually think that in the future we will deal differently with toxicity. The huge cost that this way of centralizing waste and making it travel, I mean, it doesn't make sense that the garbage collected in New York is taken to places like Kentucky in a train every day. Doesn't make sense. So probably uh, there's already a process of innovation. We don't know where it's happening that is uh, posing alternatives to that. And I think we have to have a take on this. When we did this project, for instance, in PS1, the amount of coverage, media coverage that it got was huge. For instance, it was in the Wall Street Journal, whole page. It was in the New York Times several times. It was architecture has this media attention, and we often underestimate the capacity of our ideas to travel to all these locations and produce changes. I've been called now, for instance, from places like Wisconsin to advise them on the way they will deal in the future with their water, as everyone knows, Wisconsin has what water is, with the way the water infrastructure will be built, and hopefully we will be able to scale up some of these things. So, for instance, we're working now with the museum, the Science Museum in Moscow, to again do a prototype that could help them in the museum deal with all the toxic water that they will have. Or, for instance, in Bogota, the municipality called us to produce a prototype of a sewage system, visible sewage system, that would take the water from the hills and would deal with its toxicity before it reached the aquifers of the flat land. So in a direct way or in an indirect way, many people, not only us, dealing with toxicity probably will end up having an influence in the way big scale. But of course, it's slow, and you're right. It's our effort as well to design that scalable.
I
Yeah.
agree entirely
Yeah.
with your answer. I just wondered if you think the future about future solutions at other scales,
Yeah,
because I don't
totally.
think
Yeah.
prototypes aggregate to perform at other scales. They have to be radically rethought
But I
at
also think
scale.
that in terms of water, probably the infrastructures will scale down. I think that also we will see in the future infrastructures that are operating at the scale of buildings. And I think that that's not, it's a very plausible,
I agree
yeah,
with you about
yeah,
water.
yeah. To power. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Andreas, it's so nice to see your work all together because it allows a lot of the different aspects of it to be shown in a new light. I love the first video, the video loop at the beginning, and I imagine so much of your buildings and spaces to be occupied at that tempo, that there's this energy and timing and metabolism that happens in your architecture. And so the question is about the time and the tempo of experience, because with the Mies project, it's the most static architecture one can think of. It's about contemplation, it's about stillness, it's about a perfect moment in time that almost doesn't require activity at all. And that your architecture and the representations of things that you do, from plays to the space where we see the video now to the first video, always has this sort of fast rhythm and activity in it. And so the question is what is timing to you in architecture? Is it a tool that pops the lid open of social relationships that are activated through time, or is it something else about time that you want to use as a representational tool in thinking about architecture? Because for of course for architects it's like the thing that nobody ever thinks of because architecture is fundamentally static, and yet with yours, temporalities, tempos seem to be so much a part of it. Even with PS1, that on one hand, it's about an event that happens in the evening where people are dancing and whatnot. It also happens over the course of a week where movement is almost indecipherable, but transformations happen. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah,
about what time means to you?
yeah, it's a very good question. I think architecture is always about time, and it's always temporary. Even my point with the Barcelona Pavilion, one of my intentions was to show that the pavilion was in permanent change all the time. Nothing is static there. The stones, even the stones that are supposed to be there fixed, they're permanently being transformed. So it's like the Argonauts ship, like it looks like if it was fixed, but when you stay enough time, you see that the stones are breaking. They have to take them, bring a new one, fix them. Uh, the curtains are replaced all the time. The animals are killed. Everything's the water is moving. So it's probably the camera with which we look at it that is not able to sense the evolution of things. And that's something that is a contemporary challenge. Many of the things that we're dealing with are very slow, and others are super fast. And those times are not necessarily human. I love the work of Rob Nixon, Slow Violence, that is saying the difficulty, one of the political difficulties that we have now is that a big part of the realities that are affecting us radically are happening at times that we cannot even imagine them, like for instance climate change. It's happening at the pace that we're at the end of it, but it started long time ago in 19th century or even before when carbon was started to be liberated, and even before when fossil fuels were produced, even much long before humans were here. So all these processes are very difficult to deal with because they're temporary, but they're working at times that have nothing to do with human time. The same happened with tiny things that happen so fast that it's very impossible for us to even scrutinize them. I'm doing this work that I talk about New York and Ceylon research that is much bigger. And one part is about fertility, and the environmental conditions of places like Saint-Saëns, for instance, are very much affecting many people's fertility. And that is something that is related to the purification of the air in New York that is becoming a huge hub of fertility, international fertility. But that's something that is decided in a micro time of a fecundation process. And the difficulty of producing architecture for that is equally huge than the difference. So I agree with you. Time, I think, is central in what I do, and it's very difficult. And not that much because the projects that we do, that many are temporary, but it's the realities that we're dealing with are temporary, but in times that are impossible, that are non-human times. But I think it's a conflict that we face as a humanity. Uh, it brings also other notions of what we've done in the past. Contemplation probably is crucial here. It's a way to sense many things that are moving, but are moving very, very slow. So I was studying Barcelona Pavilion it's actually the topic of my dissertation. And I've been studying, I studied that for I think like 50 years. I started in Germany and then I ended there. The thing is that when you think of the Barcelona Pavilion was uh, in itself something that was troubling. The stones were coming in from all around. There was a Berlin company that was assembling them, but they never paid even the taxes to import them into Barcelona. So basically, in January they were already dismounting the marbles and bringing them back to Berlin. And there was so many. I mean, I could go forever with things. So nothing was designed to be fixed. So, but it's true that you sit there and it stays, keeps this feeling of things staying. I love this. At the same time, I think it's a way of observing that has to do more with uh, contemplating motion, but other motions that are not that easy to perceive. Yeah, but your question for me is crystal clear.
I think your answers for the previous question kind of answer my question in terms of I want to ask about communications and first communications in terms of medium and for example like how would you describe your use of like video and a lot of GIFs and also collage in your work and also colors in terms of how color communicate in your work. Second is communication in terms of how would you describe your relationship with your clients and also people who actually use architecture and also people who doesn't know architecture at all.
Uh, okay, the first thing, all these different uh, languages, videos, GIFs, collages, colors, we want to operate in many mediums, and they're already running. So we try to learn how they work and include things that could circulate there. So we've been doing GIFs because GIFs are really good at social media. We've been doing videos because it's a way to convey things that otherwise there's no way to explain. But also we produce papers. So we publish our work in Perspecta or in Log or in, I don't know, in Threshold. Because also we want to occupy a space in the academia. So basically we try to be transmedia. We produce an architecture that travels from one media to another, and I think it's a very contemporary condition. All of us are body, but also we're social media, and we're operating in all these different spaces. So we are transmedia bodies in transmedia worlds, and we're uh, trying to be there, basically, just to exist. The second has to do, the second question was about clients. Uh, the notion of client is very important for us because we basically we live off what we do. So we're and most of our works are, I would say, paid by someone, an institution or but mostly private clients. And we are basically being very transparent about our interests, about what we've done, and uh, and we hope that they think that what we do, uh, we try to explain them at one point what's the value that we can provide. So we're very clear about that there's also a capacity to produce value with architecture. Uh, but of course, the value we create is not necessarily money. It's also uh, enrollment of different sensitivities, guarantees. We will be less uh, aggressive with realities that other people are really aggressive with. Like, and that if you can explain it is something that is very important for uh, people with sensitivities, also even with companies or with institutions. And we work with very different ones. Like if I often say that if I had to put in a table all the people I work with, it would be a crime. I mean, they would kill each other. I've worked with gay associations, and I've worked with the Catholic Church, with bishops. I've worked with super collectors, and I've worked with people that are anti-capitalist movements. I've worked, and it's not that I don't have an ideology, it's that I do my ideology very transparent, so I can deal with other people and even discuss them. So now we're working, for instance, with Real Madrid. And the first thing I told, we're doing a network of hotels for them, with hospitality centers. We propose to change that, so it's different. But basically, the first day I arrived there, and I said, like, I've never been in a football thing. I don't know who you are. Basically, I don't care about football. Actually, I don't like it, at all. So, but then, but I know about other things, and I don't need to know about football because you know about football. I can, but I know about, for instance, how to make something be part of a social tissue, and how to be sensitive and give space to many sensitivities that are not necessarily yours, and that's the way we basically work. But of course, many often it doesn't work. Basically, there's many people we tell them what we think should happen there, and then they say, well, we don't want to work with you. You're radicals. You don't understand what we're doing. Like you're going to ruin our business. You're ruining architecture at large. So yeah, it's very difficult.
That was a great talk. Thank you so much. My question is kind of, maybe it's because I'm looking at this voguing video, but it's to do with identity, and I'm interested in kind of, I mean, the way that you've presented the work. It's almost like you're opening up the closets for this white heterosexual history of architecture, like looking at the basement of the Mies Pavilion and stuff. And I'm just wondering how you consider identity, and you're talking about like creating these spaces for different identities to come through. Like, how does that play a role in your work?
Yeah, it's crucial. Your question is very important. I think identity politics are crucial at this point, growing. I think also identity politics are have been very good at understand to make us understand what architecture is about. Uh, I I love the work of I don't know, many people, from Jack Halberstam to Judith Butler, historical opening of many ideas, and what or Dora Haraway, that has nothing to do with Jack Halberstam, for instance. But I think that basically what we learn through queer studies, to identity politics, to gender studies, is that uh, identity uh, is built, and is the result of design, of the collective design, technology, context, discussions, ways of speaking, are producing gender, are producing racial difference, are basically producing races even, and the way society deals with them. And I think that's giving a very serious role to design, and a high responsibility to designers. And it's identifying also that design is distributed, and that is something that all of us do just by speaking and by calling things with different words. We're being part of that collective design. So your question for me is crucial, because I think architectural practices can learn a lot from uh, uh, identity studies, identity politics. At the same time, I think it's very important to understand that that is an open debate, and that probably will evolve soon. If you think, for instance, of the gender activism and gender theory of the 70s, was very humanly oriented, whereas now we're much more post-human. We have a post-human sensitivity, and for me, Cat Niebla is as much a subject of architecture or the stones as human. And because it's crucial to understand, for instance, the role of cell companies, or the role of Marcellus' cell, to understand even how we are humans at this point. So your question is crucial. I think there's so much that architecture can learn by dealing with this. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but at the same time, I feel like the history that was presented was mostly about like kind of a history of white heterosexual production of space. So like
Yeah.
kind of more like actively like speaking, how do you incorporate this from almost like transgressive, because you talk about like trans mediums. How do you kind of operate that sort of like hacking into this kind of white heterosexual construction of space with your own practice?
Yeah, totally. Basically, I'm challenging it. The reason why I started to do this alternative version of uh, Powers of Ten is that I found very annoying that everyone loved the images so much, and that they found them so cute. It's like, this is very critical. What we see in the Vitra commercials, if we take it seriously, for instance, in an academia or something like that, it's very weird at this point to see a movie that is based on putting actually, it's very interesting that the actress is Asian American, and the movie is very intentionally hiding that. The frames that were selected were trying to avoid her being perceived as Asian American, and that was very intentional. So there's so much that you learn when you study it. It's very weird, and of course that's a very annoying thing. So we basically were looking at the way things were happening, and at that point, for instance, Los Angeles was a cauldron of identity debates that were not in frame, basically. And the same with the Barcelona Pavilion, or even with the Placentia Clergy House. Within Catholic Church, there's so many closets and so many realities that are somehow removed by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. One of our intentions was to enable them to emerge with these disputes. Yeah, I think we could read many of the things that are happening now to architecture through the perspective of the proposal.
Thank you so much for that talk. I found it really refreshing to go to a lecture and see a drawing that kind of depicts a fight in the flower garden like so clearly. That was really great. I find your drawings like super elegant. Having never been to one of your buildings or performance or installation, your drawings are the only way I've been able to engage through your work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how your kind of specific style and vibrancy in your representation and how it kind of fits into your overall narrative.
Yeah, it's very important for me, both in the also in the teaching that I do. It's very important representation. I think of drawings and other documents as parliaments, like the Congress. Like it's a place where reality is represented. Representation has two meanings. One, it's more about the making of, let's say, language, and but there's one that is very political. It's about providing the opportunity of uh, different things to be together and being encountered in the decision making. And when we look at the parliament, you see people that are coming from very different places. I mean, human parliaments, Congress are not working that well anymore, or I don't know if ever they did. But as a concept, the idea of a chamber where you can introduce very different realities and they don't have to agree, they can keep being different. It's what I believe architectural documents and platforms are about. So for me, the question of representation is a question of political representation. Uh, when we were doing this house, for instance, it's very important to include in the drawings all these things, uh, from trees to animals, because they needed to be counted in the process of decision making. And of course, that's a lot of work, but it's a lot of work that was needed for them to be included. So we needed to know exactly the position of every branch of every tree. We needed, because then we had to make sure that the cranes were not that they were programmed in a way that they could move without cutting branches. Like these sort of very practical things require a platform of representation, and that is what I would when I don't know. Often I have this question: how do you get your students to do such an amazing, so amazing drawings? And I said, well, are they so amazing? Basically, we're working with them. We just need the information to be there because we are taking decisions on the drawing. So if they don't put all these things, they're not. There's no way for us to deal with them. That's the argument. So, but that's aesthetics for me. Uh, Aesthetics for me are tools to sense reality. So people that are, I don't know, when you think, for instance, of Rousseau, doing these amazing representations of nature, I think we basically can feel our fingers touching them and our eyes detecting the different species that he was. So it's a sensing device. Aesthetics are making things perceptible. And for me, this cyber theory is not that different than aesthetics or the discussion of aesthetics. Yeah. Ah, okay, excellent. Very good.